Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, here for another journey back into my DCOM reviewing roots. I wasn't originally sure I was ever going to make this video, because to be perfectly honest, I kept forgetting to watch the Zombies sequel. But now that Zombies 3 completes the set, I decided to do what any somewhat sane reviewer would do and watch them both. And boy were they a lot, for better and for worse. So yeah. These films were far too interesting to not discuss, so that's what we're doing today, Zombies 2, and then probably Zombies 3 as a follow-up video. So, to quickly recap for those of you who barely remember the original Zombies, it's the DCOM that decided to take the narrative pathway Descendants laid the groundwork for. Which is to say, in spite of being very in your face with the subtext, to the point that it might as well be literally spelled out for you, it does find ways to drive home its take-home points through surprisingly potent details. Details that fairly accurately, and to a degree effectively, speak honestly on the actual plights of marginalized populations that the zombies serve as stand-ins for. Zombies isn't a perfect movie by any stretch, and you could make the case that its happy-go-lucky aesthetic and tonality rubs awkwardly against the social consciousness it strives for with extreme levels of overtness. Though, I would counter just a little bit, and say that the social disparity it speaks on is somewhat helped by having a cast of humans that appear bright, colorful, and filled with enough real-world, pre-established barrier breaking that they look socially forward, but only on the face of it. You'll recall that this is the same Seabrook setting that will happily arrest a lot of zombies for the actions of one, while framing themselves as the hapless victims. It's just barely fictional, and rife with clever details like that. The biggest being how sports here function as a papering over the cracks of the actual systemic issues that have plagued, pun intended, zombie kind for the last 50-odd years. So, their acceptance, such as it was, ended up being built on the flimsiest of foundations for purely economic gains by the powers that be, so of course it was never going to hold firm once something went wrong. Such a complicated series of issues can't be resolved by simply dancing alongside each other, in the same way that the original Descendants could never have properly carried on without taking a hard look at the ramifications of Ben's proclamation, both the good and the harm. And with that, enter Zombies 2, where after the aforementioned flimsy acceptance starts taking on slightly more culturally accepted forms, to the point where it might someday become more foundational and less situational, we add in a new wrinkle with werewolves, and now it's their turn to feel the burden of being seen as dangerous monsters. It's the most obvious direction such a wrinkle could take, but it's also the most correct one. Because while these films only ever dig so deep into the historical context they're created on the basis of, it does undeniably dig. Even a cursory glance at American history's many hard-fought journeys of liberation will tell you one thing with unnerving consistency: the playbook stays the same for all groups involved. During a time period some people still living today were alive for, lest we forget how close that all was, the same disgusting, trite, and baseless think of the children rhetoric that was used against the fight for black integration was used when gay rights became more of a national talking point, and with trans rights in the here and now. But there's another layer there that isn't brought up nearly as often, because despite the intersectional nature of these social movements, a lot of black people, my people just to clarify, even to this day, view the disenfranchisement of various sexual identities and the plight of being black as entirely unrelated, to say nothing of the rampant homophobia among our ranks. There's also been a well-documented history of gay rights movements and a jarring number of individuals thereof being, let's say, unsympathetic towards the trans community. Worth emphasizing, in case it wasn't obvious enough, though it really should be, is that none of this is universally true across disenfranchised communities, but it's true enough that many scholars, way more informed than me, have studied these very topics for decades. And knowing that, arbitrary dividing lines between and among groups start making a lot more sense in the context of both this sequel and the next one. All of that was a lot, I'll grant you, but it's important to set the table here, because it provides valuable context to those not in the know regarding why there does exist that inherent contradiction, with zombies almost immediately seeing werewolves as a threat, and in Zombies 3, werewolves almost immediately seeing the aliens as a threat, alongside almost everyone else who supposedly learned their lesson in the first two movies. And even though the wolves themselves aren't coded in ways that directly fit the aforementioned history, at least not until Zombies 3 and there's only one of them, the logic of the conflict here is rooted in reality, and on top of that, the powers that be at Seabrook decide that their very existence needs to be met with reformed laws that treat all monsters like second-class citizens. Again. Because one of the smarter things Zombies 2 does is understand that when one group's rights are attacked and pushed backwards in their fight to literally survive, it impacts all groups. This is the reason the original movie gave us such a flimsy means for integration. Yes, a big part of that is the limitations of the format and genre, that much is a given, but it also represents the limitations of how far zombie acceptance is actually willing to push, meaning that it was always liable to break down with the slightest status quo change. And it gets better. Which leads into my two favorite elements of this film that, to lightly spoil a potential Zombies 3 review, were not carried over and finalized in a way that I would call good. The first involves the election that happens for student president between Bucky and Zed. Bucky is the runaway favorite from the jump, so, in response, one of the first things Zed does is make an election poster of himself that looks more quote-unquote human, which, if you've been following the racial allegories here, means he's trying to be more presentable, which by Western standards tends to equate to more white. It's not especially subtle, nor should it be. It's very blatant political posturing that he assumed would work, because he already knows a solid chunk of voters would gladly take a world where their sort of integration never happened, and zombies could just be their sports stars and nothing else. All of this culminates into the final election debates, done through a rap battle because of course Bucky would utilize aspects of a culture not his own when it suits him and degrade it any other day. This movie isn't pulling many punches here. But perhaps the best line in the entire film, one that doesn't even linger, is when Zed loses control, creating fear in the general public again, and Bucky just lives for it, just eats it all up. And then he says,
I know you won't hurt me, big guy, but they don't.
Now, Bucky is very well established as prejudiced throughout the trilogy, and there's a huge chance they whiffed on as it pertains to that in 3. But it's just so interesting to see the layers of prejudice communicated to us here. Instead of exclusively using the white savior status he sees himself as representing for the sake of tearing Zed down, he's just savvy enough to know that Zed really doesn't want to hurt anyone, and actually could benefit the school with his ideas. Bucky himself doesn't actually mind zombies joining his cheer squad so long as they can bring it on, all or nothing, but will also take immense joy in tearing them down if it means the retaining of power and status. So, the second Zed's campaign starts and subsequently leans into zombie acceptance as a platform, notably in the midst of werewolves creating uncertainty and fear within the community, he works against that very idea, plays into it, not because he believes it fully, though a rather large part of him still does very much believe it, but because he knows the people will. He knows his base will eat it up, and he knows that this is how he wins. He's never framed as correct for doing this, important to note, even when he does, in fact, win. Getting that detail right would seem obvious to the non-sociopaths watching this film, but I don't think it should be dismissed out of hand, because it's a movie where various characters and perspectives are given their own space to be incorrect even when fighting for the correct things and vice versa. So juggling all of that, while also keeping the narrative leanings consistent, would be a challenge even if it wasn't Paul Hohen at the helm, who can make a good movie out of anything. And all of this leads into my other favorite aspect of this movie as it pertains to the characterization of Addison. To break this down properly, we'll need to once again skip down memory lane and discuss how the first film sets everything up for what follows. So Addison's thing once upon a time was that she felt compelled to hide her white hair and did so using a blonde wig. Despite many solid reasons why this would never be the case, she felt that her hair made her different enough that she'd be labeled a freak if people found out. So, surprising absolutely nobody, after revealing herself as the girl with white hair following the zombies getting collectively arrested, nothing of consequence happens to her. Her life, and more vitally her social status, is unchanged. She is never once treated as less worthy of rights or forced away from social gatherings because of who she is or might be, which she doesn't even know yet at this point. Now let's clarify something else, because there's a jarring number of people that get this wrong. Her plight is genuine. It represents a part of her she doesn't quite understand, and she has every right to feel the way she does to an extent. But as far as the first two films are concerned, it does not and cannot operate on the same plane as the main text conflicts. Thankfully, both movies do understand this by way of both subtle and overt messaging. The fact that her status never changes in the first film or in the transition to the second speaks to this, but Zombies 2 takes it one step further. Because despite all of that, and her steady trajectory towards cheer captain status, her feelings are mixed because she doesn't feel like she belongs anywhere. So this time around, she really wants to be revealed to be a werewolf, and in so doing, making her an embarrassingly literal white-haired savior to a group filled with many cultural touchpoints, none of them Caucasian ones. Unless you count the European origins of the term itself, which this movie only loosely uses because it leans way further into some of the Native American cultural depictions where, in some cases, the line between humans and animals was a blurry one. It's a bit more pointed here, as Native American allusions go, compared to something like Twilight, for example, mainly because the origins of werewolves here are basically settlers of ye olde Seabrook took over their land, stole their treasure, and forced them into less than ideal living situations. And just as notably, when the wolves seek out information about their storied past from Seabrook, it turns out that it's filled with lies, omissions, and half-truths. I shouldn't need to break that one down for anyone, right? This review is basically writing itself at this point. But now let's backtrack a bit and discuss what all of that information does for Addison. In this movie's infinite wisdom, and I mean that genuinely, the writing makes it so that she actually is not revealed to be the most important werewolf in the tribe, one who is destined to grant their entire species salvation. Putting aside the wildly uncomfortable implications that the reverse decision would bring about, I think it's a really strong character arc, mainly because it's just such an honest piece of intentionally misguided characterization. This all stems from her own sense of guilt over never having been labeled a monster and never having to go through the same struggles that some of her best friends did go through and are still going through. She was fighting the good fight with them, of course, but it's not quite the same as any actual ally for any cultural movement could easily tell you. So even though she's convinced herself that she has to be a werewolf, that she needs to find some type of marginalized meaning inside her own relatively innocuous struggle that, gentle reminder, does nothing to meaningfully shift or impair her social standing, her guilt is not rewarded. And I really like that the movie doesn't force her into a subjugation role simply for insisting on finding a more narratively important place inside a story filled with cultural subjugation. I really like the idea that she wants to be the change and continues to be without literally becoming the change. Now granted, the framing of actually finding the Wolf's Moonstone, which is what she was originally meant to lead them to, is a bit unclear, but it's not an oversight I think does any damage to anything else presented here, especially compared to simply being a modern DCOM, and all the weird tonal juxtapositions that come with framing more serious plights a bit too loose and comedically. There's a positive side to that too, as we touched on near the start, but it's really weird that zombie rights are getting mutilated right in front of the whole school, but Zed treats that with less urgency than a simple misunderstanding with Addison. But I would take that any day of the week compared to a more quote-unquote serious film that misses the point entirely. And say what you will about Zombies 2, but it gets a lot of points right. And so much of it is contained within the blink and you might miss it details, like when monster curfew is re-established, emphasis on the re, but the gang thinks they need to save Addison. There's a worry among the zombies that the curfew enforcement would make it hard to navigate, but Bree mentions how she didn't have any problems with it, and it just plays into this interesting sense of not understanding the type of disadvantages that come standard to zombies, even when it's literally right in front of you. I also like the detail that Zoe, Zed's younger sister and the youngest among them, is unbothered by the idea of werewolves because the prejudice against her kind is getting better on the face of it, and whatever prejudice she might have towards other people hasn't been learned yet. And I like the detail carried over from the first movie with how werewolves also have their own language and specific inflections and tones that go into how they communicate. It's nothing extravagant, but again, it's a nice touch that a lesser film wouldn't bother with. All of that said, however, this movie does find itself with the Descendants 2 problem of running out of steam, and it really did feel like it couldn't round out some points that seemed important, or may have been cut in the editing cycles for the sake of making it breezier to watch. So I think being considerably shorter than the equally socially ambitious D2 worked against it. For example, I wanted to like the fact that the power plant, which represents the origin of zombies, is now gone forever. It felt like this was going to be Eliza's big revolutionary touchpoint this go round, except she'd be more in the right about it. But the demolition largely happens without much acknowledgement of what was lost, and the third movie doesn't even mention it. That, and in line with the disadvantage of a cast-centric musical format, it feels kind of really awkward to be all buddy-buddy with Bucky now. You'll recall that he represents the very establishment who sought to jeopardize everything the others fought for the second another fight happens. Zombies 3 does Bucky even less favors in my opinion, but in this movie, a movie that is surprisingly clever in highlighting his complicated and very flawed system of beliefs within a loud and proud characterization, that doesn't do him any favors either. It feels a bit too similar to the standard Sharpay-Evans set, where the musical resolution is forced to be cast wide, which means on some level being somewhat okay with the horrible things that happened, until they repeat. Except that's way more acceptable in a story like High School Musical, where Troy and Gabriella getting the part or not, being together or not, isn't meant as a stand-in for their right to exist. Pun fully intended here, it's not even the same ballgame. So on top of Zombies 2 being flawed due to the musical DCOM foundation it's built on, it also doesn't quite last as long as it needed to make the most of a handful of now lingering plot elements, and in so doing, also creates its most fundamental flaw on the back end, which is how it oddly de-emphasizes how horrifying it is that the system failed these groups again, and the powers that be still hold on to that power. They can act the part and accept you, for now, but the zombies learned a powerful lesson here, that the world can turn on them real quick. You can't sing and dance your way out of problems that deeply ingrained unless the roots change, not the branches. Instead, it uses the cinematic language of song as a means of expressing a desire that's become very popular in the political lexicon over the last few years, a return to normal. This despite normal, and the various ways one could define it, never having been good enough, in their world or in ours, because neither world is a sitcom. In a movie that otherwise seems to really get it, right down to the chilling musical atmosphere they create when Bucky first addresses the school as its new president, it's weird that they don't get that, or more likely, weren't allowed to push that far. So while there's so many thoughtful, insightful, and even scarily prescient writing touches in this sequel, there's also no shortage of holes and gaps that muddy the waters to a degree. And while it would delight me to tell you that Zombies 3 was the answer to the holes, and the gaps, and the undrinkable water, that would be me lying to you. Rather, Zombies 3 goes in some weird and wild directions, some of which I still can't quite believe even after having watched it. All of that and more to come when we talk about that in full next time. But until then, thanks for watching.